The Jewish members of the conspiracy have used an organization called the Anti-Defamation League as an instrument to try to convince everyone that any mention of the Rothschilds or their allies is an attack on all Jews. In this way, they have stifled almost all honest scholarship on international bankers and made the subject taboo within universities. Any individual or book exploring the subject is immediately attacked by hundreds of ADL communities all over the country. The ADL has never let truth or logic interfere with its highly professional smear jobs. When no evidence is apparent, the ADL, which staunchly oppose so-called McCarthyism, accuses people of being latent anti-Semites. Can you imagine how they would yowl and scream if someone accused them of being latent communists? Actually, nobody has a right to be more angry at the Rothschild clique than their fellow Jews. The war bugs, part of the Rothschild empire, helped finance Adolf Hitler. There were few, if any, Rothschilds or war bugs in the Nazi prison camps. They sat out the war in luxurious hotels in Paris or immigrated to the United States or England. As a group, Jews have suffered most at the hands of these power seekers. A Rothschild has much more in common with the Rockefeller than he does with a tailor from Budapest or the Bronx. Since the keystone of the international banking empires has been government bonds, it has been in the interest of these international bankers to encourage government debt. The higher the debt, the more the interest. Nothing drives government deeply into debt like a war. It's not uncommon practice among international bankers to finance both sides of the bloodiest military conflicts. For example, during our Civil War, the North was financed by the Rothschilds through the American agent August Belmont, and the American South through the irregulars, Rothschild relatives. But while wars and revolutions have been useful to international bankers in gaining or increasing control over governments, the key to such control has always been the control of money. You can control a government if you have it in your debt. A creditor is in a position to demand the privileges of monopoly from the sovereign. Money-seeking governments have granted monopolies in state banking, natural resources, oil, concessions, and transportation. However, the monopoly which the international financiers most covet is control over a nation's money. Eventually, these international bankers actually owned as private corporations the central banks of the various European nations. The Bank of England, Bank of France, and Bank of Germany were not owned by their respective governments, as almost everyone imagines, but were privately owned monopolies granted by the heads of state, usually in return for loans. Under this system, observed Reginald McKenna, president of the Midlands Bank of England, he quotes, "Those that create and issue the money and credit direct the policies of government and hold in their hands the destiny of the people. Once the government is in debt to the bankers, it is at their mercy." A frightening example was cited by the London Financial Times of September 26, 1921, which revealed that even at that time, half a dozen men at the top of the big five banks could upset the whole fabric of government finance by refraining from renewing treasury bills. All those who have sought dictatorial control over modern nations have understood the necessity of a central bank. When the League of Just Men hired a hack revolutionary named Karl Marx to write a blueprint for conquest called the Communist Manifesto. The fifth plank read, quote, centralization of credit in the lands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Lenin later said that the establishment of a central bank was 90% of communizing a country. Such conspirators knew that you cannot take control of a nation without military force unless that nation has a central bank through which you can control its economy. The anarchist Bakunin sarcastically remarked about the followers of Karl Marx, they have one foot in the bank and one foot in the socialist movement. The international financiers set up their own frontman in charge of Europe's central banks. Professor Quigley reports, it must not be felt that these heads of the world's chief central banks were themselves substantive powers in world finance. They were not. Rather, they were the technicians and agents of the dominant investment bankers of their own countries, who had raised them up and were perfectly capable of throwing them down. The substantive financial powers of the world were in the hands of these investment bankers, also called international or merchant bankers, who remained largely behind the scenes in their own unincorporated private banks. These formed a system of international cooperation and national dominance which was more private, more powerful, and more secret than that of their agents in the central banks. Dr. Quigley also reveals that the international bankers who owned and controlled the banks of England and France maintained their power even after those banks were theoretically socialized. Naturally, those who controlled the central banks of Europe were eager from the start to fasten a similar establishment on the United States. From the earliest days, the Founding Fathers had been conscious of attempts to control America through money manipulation, and they carried on a running battle with the international bankers. Thomas Jefferson wrote to John Adams, quote, I sincerely believe with you that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, end quote. But even though America did not have a central bank after President Jackson abolished it in 1836, the European financiers and their American agents managed to obtain a great deal of control over our monetary system. Gustavus Myers, in his History of the Great American Fortunes, reveals, under the surface, the Rothschilds had long had a powerful influence in dictating American financial laws. The law records show that they were powers in the old Bank of the United States, abolished by Andrew Jackson. During the 19th century, the leading financiers of the metropolitan East often cut one another's financial throats. But as their Western rule victims started to organize politically, the robber barons saw that they had a community of interest, toward which they must work together to protect themselves from thousands of irate farmers and up-and-coming competitors. This diffusion of economic power was one of the main factors stimulating the demands for a central bank by would-be business and financial monopolists. In Years of Plunder, Proctor Hansel writes of this era. Among the Morgans, the Conloebs, and other similar pillars of the industrial order, there was less disposition to become involved in disagreements that led to financial dislocation. A community of interest came into being, with results that were highly beneficial. But aside from the major eastern centers, most American bankers and their customers still distrusted the whole concept.